Maybe you've sat down with a financial advisor. Maybe you've used an online retirement calculator. Maybe you've plugged your information into one of those planning tools that promises to tell you whether you're on track. And then, after all the calculations are finished, a number appears on the screen. Your probability of success is 90%. At first glance, that sounds incredible. 90%. It sounds scientific. It sounds precise. It sounds reassuring. It feels as though someone has looked into the future and handed you an answer. For many people, that number instantly creates a sense of relief. Retirement can feel uncertain. Markets move up and down. Inflation rises and falls. Unexpected expenses show up without warning. So when a retirement plan produces a number that suggests everything will probably work out, it feels comforting. But what if that number doesn't actually answer the question you're really asking? Because deep down, most people aren't asking whether they'll technically avoid running out of money. They're asking something much more personal. Will I feel secure? Will I be able to enjoy my life? Will I have the freedom to say yes to experiences that matter? Will I spend my retirement living or worrying? And that's where retirement planning gets far more interesting. Because the truth is that a retirement plan can have a very high probability of success and still leave someone feeling financially anxious for decades. Think about that for a moment. You could have a plan that looks fantastic on paper. You could have millions invested. You could have a retirement strategy that financial software loves. And yet, every time you book a trip, help a grandchild with college, or make a major purchase, you might still wonder whether you're spending too much. That tension exists because retirement isn't simply a math problem. It's a human experience. It's about waking up every day and deciding how to use your time, your energy, and yes, your money. And increasingly, that's exactly where retirement research is headed. For years, the industry focused almost entirely on one question: will the money last? Today, researchers are beginning to ask something different. What kind of life does the money create while it lasts? That's a very different conversation. Before we go deeper, let's make sure we're all talking about the same thing. When someone says you have a 90% probability of success, what does that actually mean? Many people hear that phrase and imagine it means there's a 90% chance they'll have a wonderful retirement. That's not what it means. In reality, your retirement plan is typically tested against thousands of possible future scenarios. Some simulations assume strong market returns. Others assume weak returns. Some include periods of high inflation. Others include recessions, bear markets, and difficult economic environments. The software runs your plan through all of those possibilities. Then it counts how many times you avoided running out of money. If you survive 90% of those simulations, your plan receives a 90% probability of success. That's it. The number doesn't tell you whether you'll feel comfortable. It doesn't tell you whether you'll travel. It doesn't tell you whether you'll spend confidently. It doesn't tell you whether you'll spend the next 20 years checking your account balance every morning. It simply tells you how often your portfolio avoided hitting zero. That's important information, but it's only part of the story. In the financial planning world, there are some common benchmarks. A success rate above 90% is generally viewed as highly conservative. A success rate between 80% and 90% is often considered a sweet spot. Even plans in the 70% range are frequently viewed as workable, depending on the retiree's flexibility and circumstances. As a result, many advisors aim for something around 85% to 90%. It feels responsible. It feels prudent. It feels safe. And to be fair, there are good reasons for that approach. No one wants to encourage reckless spending. No one wants retirees facing avoidable financial hardship. But there's another side to this conversation that doesn't get enough attention. What if the pursuit of certainty comes at a cost? What if chasing an extremely high probability of success means you're sacrificing experiences, opportunities, and enjoyment that you could have comfortably afforded? In other words, what if you're protecting yourself from a future problem that never arrives? This is where retirement planning becomes less about numbers and more about trade-offs. Because every financial decision involves a trade-off. Spend more today and you may have less flexibility tomorrow. Spend less today and you may be giving up experiences you'll never get back. The challenge isn't eliminating trade-offs. The challenge is making conscious choices about them. Unfortunately, traditional retirement planning often treats retirement like a pass-or-fail exam. Either your money lasts or it doesn't. Success or failure. Black or white. Simple, clean, easy to measure, and completely disconnected from how real people actually experience retirement. Imagine two retirees. The first runs out of money by a few $100s at age 96. The second runs out of money by several $100,000 at age 70. Under many traditional planning models, both outcomes are labeled failures. But are they really the same? Of course not. One is a minor shortfall at the very end of life. The other is a devastating financial event that fundamentally changes someone's retirement. Yet the old framework often treats them as identical. That's one of the reasons retirement researchers have begun challenging traditional definitions of success. Instead of asking whether someone technically succeeded or failed, they're asking a much richer question. How much of the life they wanted were they actually able to fund? That shift changes everything, because now we're not just measuring portfolio survival, we're measuring lifestyle. We're measuring experiences. We're measuring well-being. And perhaps most importantly, we're measuring retirement the way retirees actually live it. After all, nobody wakes up in retirement thinking about Monte Carlo simulations. They think about visiting family. They think about travel. They think about hobbies. They think about helping loved ones. They think about enjoying the years they've spent decades working toward. Those are the things that matter. And increasingly, retirement research is recognizing that reality. To understand how retirement planning has evolved, it helps to look at where it started. For decades, one of the most influential ideas in retirement planning was the famous 4% rule. The concept was straightforward. A retiree withdraws 4% of their portfolio in the first year of retirement and then adjusts that amount annually for inflation. Simple, predictable, easy to explain. And for many years, it provided a valuable framework for thinking about retirement income. The beauty of the rule was its simplicity. People could quickly estimate whether they were financially prepared for retirement without needing advanced financial models. But simplicity comes with limitations, because real life rarely follows a fixed formula. Human beings aren't spreadsheets. We don't spend exactly the same amount every year. We don't adjust our lives according to mathematical formulas. We respond to circumstances. We respond to opportunities. We respond to emotions. Think about your own spending habits. When you feel optimistic and confident, you're probably more willing to spend. When uncertainty creeps in, you naturally become more cautious. Retirement is no different. In fact, retirement may magnify those tendencies. A retiree who watches the market decline by 30% isn't likely to continue spending exactly the same way as before. Likewise, someone whose investments have performed exceptionally well may feel comfortable enjoying a little more freedom. This recognition gave rise to an important shift in retirement research. Researchers began exploring the idea of dynamic spending. Instead of assuming retirees spend the exact same amount every year, dynamic spending strategies acknowledge something obvious. People adapt. They adjust. They make changes when circumstances change. One of the most influential approaches came from Jonathan Guyton and William Klinger. Their research introduced spending guardrails. The idea was refreshingly realistic. Rather than blindly withdrawing the same amount forever, retirees could make adjustments based on portfolio performance. If markets performed well, spending could increase. If markets struggled, spending might temporarily pause or decrease. The result was a retirement strategy that behaved much more like actual human behavior. For the first time, retirement planning wasn't solely focused on portfolio survival. It started examining the path retirees would travel along the way. But even that wasn't the final answer, because introducing flexibility created an entirely new question. How much flexibility is reasonable? After all, not all spending adjustments feel the same. Imagine someone tells you that if markets perform poorly, you may need to reduce spending by 5%. Most people can probably live with that. Maybe you take one less vacation. Maybe you postpone a home project. Maybe you dine out a little less frequently. Not ideal, but manageable. Now imagine someone says you might need to reduce spending by 30%. That feels very different. Suddenly we're talking about meaningful lifestyle changes. Suddenly we're talking about sacrifices that affect daily life. That's where retirement planning becomes deeply personal. Because retirement isn't merely about what is mathematically possible. It's about what is emotionally acceptable. This is where the conversation began moving in a fascinating direction. Instead of focusing exclusively on probabilities, researchers and advisors started translating retirement risk into something people could actually understand. Rather than saying, you have an 85% probability of success, they might say, if markets perform poorly, you may need to reduce spending by approximately 10%. Notice how different those statements feel. The first sounds technical. The second feels real. The first appeals to logic. The second connects directly to daily life. And that's important because most people don't experience retirement through probabilities. They experience retirement through choices. Can I afford this trip? Can I help my children? Can I replace my car? Can I spend confidently without worrying? Those are the questions retirees ask themselves. A percentage doesn't answer those questions. But understanding potential spending adjustments often does. Suddenly, retirement planning becomes less abstract. It becomes something tangible, something relatable, something human. And perhaps the most valuable question a retiree can ask isn't, what's my probability of success? Instead, it may be, can I comfortably live with the adjustments my plan might require? That's a question people can actually evaluate. Maybe a 5% spending reduction feels perfectly reasonable. Maybe a 10% reduction still feels manageable. Maybe a 20% reduction crosses a line. There isn't a universal answer. The right answer depends on the individual, their lifestyle, their priorities, their comfort with uncertainty, their willingness to adapt. This shift in thinking has also revealed something surprising. A very high probability of success isn't always a sign of an optimized retirement plan. Sometimes it's a sign that someone is being too conservative. That idea may sound uncomfortable at first. We've been conditioned to believe higher probabilities are always better. Higher scores, higher percentages, higher confidence. More is better. But retirement planning doesn't always work that way. Imagine someone who retires with a portfolio capable of supporting significantly more spending. Yet they consistently deny themselves experiences because they're afraid of running out of money. They skip trips they've dreamed about for years. They avoid helping family members when they easily could. They hesitate to enjoy their wealth, despite having accumulated it precisely for this stage of life. Technically, their plan may be extremely safe, but is it successful? That's where modern retirement research introduces a second type of risk. Most people focus on overspending risk, the risk of spending too much and running short later. That risk is real. But there's another risk that receives far less attention: underspending risk, the risk of spending too little, the risk of unnecessarily restricting your life, the risk of carrying financial fear into a period of life that was meant to provide freedom. Think about how many people spend 40 years saving diligently. They delay gratification, they make sacrifices, they contribute consistently, they build wealth carefully. And then, when retirement finally arrives, they continue acting as though every dollar spent is dangerous. They've mastered accumulation, but they struggle with decumulation. They know how to save. They don't know how to spend. That challenge is far more common than many people realize. Because spending in retirement isn't just a financial decision, it's an emotional one. Many retirees have spent decades viewing money as something to protect. Suddenly, being asked to spend it feels unnatural, even when the math supports it, even when the plan supports it, even when their future is secure. And that's why retirement planning today increasingly focuses on optimizing experience rather than maximizing survival probabilities. The goal isn't simply preserving wealth. The goal is using wealth to create a meaningful life. That doesn't mean spending recklessly. It doesn't mean ignoring risks. It doesn't mean abandoning prudent planning. It means recognizing that money is a tool. And like any tool, its value comes from how it improves your life. At some point, retirement planning stops being about maximizing account balances. It starts becoming about maximizing fulfillment. And that distinction may be one of the most important developments in modern retirement research. Because at the end of the day, very few people look back on their lives and wish they had accumulated a slightly larger investment account. What they often wish for are experiences, memories, relationships, moments shared with people they love. Those opportunities don't last forever. Retirement planning isn't just about making sure your money survives. It's about making sure your life remains rich, meaningful, and deeply satisfying while you're here to enjoy it. That's a very different objective. And in many ways, it's a far more important one. One of the most powerful contributions to this conversation comes from research that challenges another assumption many retirement models still make. The assumption is that retirees spend the same amount throughout retirement. At first glance, that sounds reasonable. After all, if you need a certain amount to live today, wouldn't you need roughly the same amount 10 or 20 years from now? Not necessarily. In reality, retirement spending often follows a very different pattern. Think about the first decade of retirement. For many people, these years are filled with energy, mobility, and excitement. They're the years people have been dreaming about while sitting in meetings, commuting to work, and watching vacation days disappear. These are often the years of travel, the years of adventure, the years of crossing items off a bucket list, the years of saying yes to opportunities that were postponed during a busy career. It's not uncommon for spending to be relatively high during this phase. People are active, they're engaged, they're experiencing life. Then something interesting begins to happen. As retirees move into later stages of retirement, spending often declines. Not because they're forced to spend less, but because their priorities naturally evolve. The expensive trips become less frequent. The desire to constantly travel may diminish. Certain lifestyle costs disappear. Daily routines become simpler. Many retirees discover they don't need as much discretionary spending as they once expected. Of course, healthcare expenses may increase later in life, but overall spending patterns often look very different from the flat line assumed by traditional planning models. This matters because retirement plans should reflect reality. A retirement model that assumes spending never changes may be mathematically neat, but life isn't neat. Life moves. Life changes. People change. And retirement planning should account for those changes. This brings us to another incredibly important idea. Retirement is not a pass-or-fail event. It's a spectrum. That may sound simple, but it's actually a profound shift in perspective. For years, retirement success was measured by one outcome. Did the portfolio survive, yes or no? Success or failure? But life rarely works in absolutes. Imagine someone who enters retirement with a vision of spending $100,000 per year. Over the course of retirement, they successfully fund 95% of that goal. Maybe they take slightly fewer trips. Maybe they postpone a few purchases. Maybe they make modest adjustments during difficult market environments. Would most people consider that retirement a failure? Probably not. In fact, many would consider it highly successful. Yet under some traditional models, it could still be classified as a failure because the original spending target wasn't fully achieved. That's where the older framework starts to break down. Because retirees don't experience retirement in binary terms. They experience it in degrees. A retirement that funds 95% of your desired lifestyle may feel nearly identical to one that funds 100%. Even an 85% outcome might still provide tremendous satisfaction, depending on the nature of the adjustments required. That's why modern research increasingly focuses on lifestyle outcomes, rather than technical definitions of success. The question becomes, how much of the life you wanted were you able to enjoy? That's a far more meaningful measure. And perhaps even more importantly, researchers have begun recognizing that not all spending categories carry the same emotional weight. This is where retirement planning becomes deeply human. Let's imagine two scenarios. In the first scenario, market conditions force you to eliminate a luxury vacation. Disappointing? Absolutely. Life-changing? Probably not. In the second scenario, financial pressures force you to reduce healthcare spending or compromise on housing needs. Now we're talking about something entirely different. The financial impact may appear similar on paper, but the emotional impact is dramatically different. That's because certain expenses contribute far more to our well-being than others. Economists often describe this concept using the word utility. In simple language, utility refers to the value or satisfaction we receive from something. And when it comes to retirement spending, some dollars create far more value than others. A dollar spent protecting health often matters more than a dollar spent on luxury. A dollar spent maintaining independence may matter more than a dollar spent on convenience. A dollar spent supporting basic needs often carries far greater importance than a dollar spent on optional upgrades. Understanding this distinction changes the way we think about retirement risk. Because the real question isn't simply, will spending need to be reduced? The real question is, which spending might need to be reduced? That's a much more useful conversation. It's also a much more realistic one. Because life isn't experienced through percentages. It's experienced through daily choices, through comfort, through security, through freedom, through relationships, through peace of mind. Another fascinating area of retirement research focuses on something many people overlook: income stability. When researchers examine how retirees behave, they consistently find something surprising. People tend to spend money differently depending on where that money comes from. Consider Social Security. Every month, a payment arrives. It's predictable. It's reliable. It feels like income. Because of that, retirees often feel comfortable spending most of it. The same is often true for pensions and certain guaranteed income products. These income streams create confidence. They create stability. They reduce uncertainty. Now compare that to an investment portfolio. Even if the portfolio is substantial, it often feels different. Instead of feeling like income, it feels like wealth that must be protected. It feels vulnerable to market declines. It feels uncertain, and as a result, retirees frequently become more cautious. The numbers may suggest they can spend comfortably, yet emotionally, they hesitate. This difference between guaranteed income and portfolio wealth has enormous implications, because retirement confidence isn't determined solely by how much money someone has. It's also influenced by how secure that money feels. Think about two retirees with exactly the same net worth. On paper, they look identical, but one receives enough guaranteed income to cover all essential expenses: housing, food, utilities, healthcare, basic living costs. The other depends heavily on investment withdrawals to cover those same necessities. Even if their account balances are identical, their experiences may be completely different. The first retiree wakes up each morning knowing their essentials are covered. The second retiree may constantly monitor market performance because their daily lifestyle depends directly on portfolio withdrawals. That's a huge psychological difference, and psychology matters far more than many financial models acknowledge. Because retirement isn't lived inside a spreadsheet, it's lived inside the human mind. It's lived through emotions, it's lived through confidence, it's lived through uncertainty, it's lived through the stories we tell ourselves about money. And ultimately, the most successful retirement plan may not be the one with the highest probability score. It may be the one that allows you to sleep peacefully at night, the one that gives you permission to enjoy your life, the one that helps you spend with confidence rather than fear, the one that balances prudence with possibility. Because retirement is not simply about protecting assets. It's about creating a life worth living. It's about transforming decades of hard work into experiences, relationships, freedom, and fulfillment. And perhaps that's the biggest lesson modern retirement research is teaching us. Money matters, planning matters, preparation matters, but ultimately those things are not the destination. They're simply the tools that help you reach it. The destination is a retirement that feels secure, a retirement that feels meaningful, a retirement that feels like the life you've spent years building toward. And that experience cannot be fully captured by a single percentage on a screen.